Chapter 18. As the sun peeked over the horizon none of Houston could see, a small figure prodded Melody awake.
Melody, wake up. Where's Blaine? Why didn't he come get me?
She squeezed her eyes closed and scratched her forehead, knowing two things. She had not gotten nearly enough sleep, and it was way too early for anyone to be waking her up. Huh?
Where's Blaine? Why didn't he come get me?
The words were whispered, but near frantic. Slowly her eyes came open, and she looked around, trying to get some part of her to latch onto reality enough so she would know where she was and what was going on. Then, as she lay there, sights and images began to flood through her mind. The phone call. Blaine coming with Dylan. Blaine. Dylan. And then she came full awake. Oh, Dylan, sweetheart. Still blinking the sleep from her eyes, she sat up, feeling both the stiffness of her back and the pounding of her head. When she looked up, he stood there, a thin, spindly thing in his Spider-Man pajamas and tousled hair. Instantly, her heart went out to him. After today, his world would never again be the same. Come here. She pulled him down to her side, knowing she couldn't lie, but having no clue how to tell him the truth. He sat down right next to her and scratched his head where his hair stuck up in an odd swoop.
Why didn't Blaine come and get me?
The middle of her heart heaved, and she hugged him to her. He did, sweetheart. He did come and get you. Leaning down, she kissed his hair. But something happened, and he brought you back.
Why?
Why? The question dogged her as well. Well, sweetheart, he needed somewhere for you to be safe, so he brought you back here.
Safe? But I wanted to go home.
Oh, God, help. What do I say to him? I know, but Blaine's dealing with some things, and he needed a place for you to stay, so I said he could bring you here. Are you hungry?
Yeah.
He scratched that spot again.
Do you have pancakes?
She smiled the only smile she knew how to form. Yeah, let's go get some. It was nearly 9:30 when Blaine woke up. His first thought was, where was he? His second thought was, why was he here? His third was a rush of remembering. Mom. The name cut through him like a hot sword as his eyes came wide open. Oh no, this can't be for real. He rubbed his eyes and sighed, trying to choke back the tears. Somehow he had to keep it together. They were counting on him. Dylan. The thought brought up the image of the child sleeping in his car, the police lights swirling over his angelic face. Exhausted to the point of not being able to force himself to move, Blaine somehow got his feet out of the bed and onto the floor. Every drop of energy in him was gone. He ran his hand down his face, squeezing the ache down into his heart. Knowing he had to, he reached for his glasses and put them on. It was only then that he really noticed the room. Her room. White and pink, it was the epitome of a girl's room. Funny, he'd never really considered her a girly girl. Not like this room indicated anyway. Pushing those thoughts aside to deal with more pressing matters, he reached over and pulled his navy bathrobe off the end of the bed. It was one of the few things he'd rescued from the house the night before. His heart jolted at the thought, and he exhaled hard. He wouldn't think about those things now. He couldn't. Although he was sure he looked atrocious, he needed to check on Dylan. His only hope was that his brother might still be asleep. Dumping the having to tell him on Melody seemed the height of weakness. Yet some small part of him hoped she'd already told him. Wrapping the robe around himself, Blaine trudged down the stairs. It was so strange to be in her house like this. It felt very intimate in a way he couldn't quite explain. After all, he'd been with girls before, but never, ever like this. And this was much more intimidating. He heard the voices in the kitchen, and with one more breath, he pushed the swinging door open. Dylan looked up from his puzzle at the table.
Blaine!
In the next second, his brother was in his arms. He bent and hugged him, having no idea what he knew and what he didn't. Then he glanced up, seeing her movement at the sink. Melody turned, and her eyes were at once sad, knowing, and sympathetic. See, I told you Blaine would be here."
Did you see? Did you see?
Dylan asked in excitement.
I'm doing this puzzle with the horses.
"That's nice," Blaine said, barely seeing it. After only a moment's stop, he stepped over to Melody, and their embrace was like nothing he'd ever experienced. It was simply pure, no judgment, no lies. He held her to him, wanting it to never end. When he finally released her, she pulled back and surveyed him. "How are you doing?" He tried to smile, but only half his smile went up. Once again, it was time to get really serious. "Did you—" He glanced at Dylan. "Does he know?" Aching guilt went through her. "No, I thought it was better if we told him together." Blaine nodded both his understanding and his agreement. He reached down between them and took her hand. When he turned and saw the child sitting at the table, innocently putting the puzzle together, he had to take a breath. "Dear Lord, I need some words here. Please." Together they walked to the table. "Hey, buddy, can we talk to you a minute?" Dylan looked up, and the light in his eyes flickered.
Sure.
Carefully, Blaine sat down and pulled the child onto his lap. The breath did nothing to calm the chaos in his spirit. Last night, when we went home, something happened." It was then that Blaine felt her hands on his shoulders, and he looked up at her. Silent support drifted from her gaze. He returned to the task. It was something really, really bad.
Is Mom hurt?
Dylan asked, clearly worried. "Yeah, Mom got hurt. Dylan, Mom died last night. She got mixed up in something really bad, and she just couldn't get out." For a long moment, there was no response.
I want to see her.
The simple request tore through Blaine. "Well, I don't know if we can, buddy."
I want to see her. I want to see Mom.
"I know that. I don't know if they'll let us yet."
But why can't I see her? I want to see her.
Blaine was losing control with every protest his brother made. Then he felt Melody move. She stepped around him and sat on her heels in front of Dylan. Leveling her gaze at him, she reached up and touched his arm. "You loved your mom a lot, huh?" Dylan was crying now. He wiped his eyes with his shirt sleeve. "I know you did. Come here." And Melody pulled him into her embrace. For as little sense as any of it made, Blaine wrapped his arms around them as well. As one, they cried for the loss of one life and the unknown of the one they now faced. Eve and AJ showed up at 10:15, just after Blaine had managed to get himself into something decent. He took one look at Eve and shook his head as he stepped into her arms. She just held him, allowing his grief to surface and overrun its banks once again. He wondered if he would ever again feel whole. When he let her go, he held his hand out to AJ. The handshake lasted only a second, and then AJ pulled him into his embrace. Something about that gesture tipped the scales on Blaine's equilibrium. With a hard pat on his back, AJ let him go. It was obvious they wanted to say something, but it was equally obvious they had no idea what that something was. Eve's gaze slid past him to Dylan sitting on the couch, ostensibly watching a cartoon. However, Blaine, less than anyone, knew what he was thinking. Eve laid her hand on Blaine's arm and stepped past him to his brother. On the couch, she simply sat and put her arm around the little boy's shoulder. Instantly, he huddled into her. Blaine couldn't help but think they both knew just how deeply loss could ache. "Have you called the police yet?" AJ asked, wiping the bridge of his nose with his thumb. "I imagine they're going to do an autopsy." Blaine nodded. "It's this morning. They think they'll release the body around 4 or so." "And the funeral home?" It occurred to Blaine how much more about this whole procedure AJ probably knew. As for him, he felt as if he was stranded in a pitch-black room, bumping into things, thus bruising his spirit for all eternity. "I don't know. I've never really done this kind of thing before." AJ nodded as the doorbell rang. "I'll get it," Melody said, striding in from the kitchen. When she had changed into the smoky sheath twined with white lace, he had no idea. In seconds, there were voices, A few more seconds, and Jeff and Lisa came around the corner. Upon seeing Blaine, Jeff held out his hand. The sheer amount of love in the room was enough to bring him to his knees. When he had made such good friends, he had no idea. By the time they left for the funeral home, they had an entire caravan. Blaine, Melody, and Dylan with Eve and AJ, Jeff and Lisa, and Gabe and Ashley. Blaine kept telling them they didn't all have to come, but truthfully, he was glad they hadn't listened when they walked into the funeral home. He clutched Melody's hand tighter, hoping somehow she could keep him standing. The funeral director offered his hand first to Blaine, and then to each of the others in turn. Most of the rest of the evening passed in such a blur that Blaine hardly remembered it. He answered the questions, made the decisions that needed to be made. The few times that he stumbled, someone was there to catch him, lift him up, and set him back right again. All the actual arrangements were easy. Keep it simple, that's what he kept saying. I don't know, whatever's easiest. Keep it simple. If he said it once, he said it 100 times. He tried to monitor Dylan, but that was difficult. Somehow, though, Eve had understood to take him under her wing, and she had done just that with remarkable ease and grace. Blaine was grateful for that. He knew he couldn't have done it. And then they were leaving. They would be back the next afternoon for a brief service, and then internment. Internment. It was such a strange word. It kept running through his head as they drove back to Melody's place. He didn't even really know what it meant. As they drove, he put his hand on his mouth and gazed out at the late evening sky. 24 hours. 24 little hours. 24 hours ago, he was adding up his commissions and wondering if they would be enough to afford a new apartment. And now, inexplicably, he was here, driving home from a funeral home. A funeral home. That was another strange term. Home denoted a place you wanted to be. Funeral did not. His brain relentlessly traced through every strange thing about this new existence, and there was so much strangeness there. In no time, they were back at Melody's. Time had become a strange thing too, measured in moments and lulls rather than seconds and minutes. He got out and helped Melody. She wrapped her arm through his as they waited for Dylan to disembark. And then, as one, they walked into the house. Where the food came from, Blaine wasn't at all sure. All he could ever tell was that Melody was somehow directing an army of volunteers. The women made dinner, they all ate, and then, in a blink, everything was cleaned. How she managed it all he couldn't exactly tell because his mind was not on food or cleaning or anything even close to normal. And then, as quickly as they had come, their friends headed out, promising to be there the next morning. Blaine shook their hands, hugged them, and told them thanks without ever really knowing he'd done anything. It was like there was this huge fog over his whole being that he wasn't at all sure would ever dissipate.
I don't want to sleep by myself tonight,
Dylan said when everyone else was gone. Melody bent, putting her hand on his arm. Why don't you sleep with Blaine up in my bed tonight? Something about that simple image, her so calm and caring as she dealt with Dylan, dragged up gratefulness Blaine had never known he had possessed. Dylan nodded and headed up the stairs. A moment, and Melody stepped over to his big brother, who took her once again into his arms. She put her hand on his chest, just over his heart. How are you doing? Tiredly, he nodded. I'm okay. Thanks for all you did today. Her gaze at him was full of soft admiration. Hey, we're a team, remember? And he had no choice but to pull her to him again. It truly was incredible that she could be so tired 2 nights in a row and yet have no hope of getting to sleep. As she lay on the couch, Melody's mind traced through her concern for Blaine and Dylan, and finally about what tomorrow would bring. What must it be like to bury your mother? Over and over again that thought went through her mind. How horrible that must be. In desperation, she finally got up and went to the kitchen. There was chamomile tea. It was supposed to help insomnia. She was trying to be quiet, but when she heard the sound, she knew it hadn't worked as well as she would have liked. Surprise went through her when she turned to find it was her own mother who had stepped into the room. Can't sleep?" her mother asked. Only one other time had Melody seen her mother look so tired. Melody shook her head as she stirred the tea. "I just keep thinking about what happened, about how Blaine goes on from this. I mean, how that's even possible?" Her mother sat at the table and waited for Melody to sit as well. There was something about the way her mother was looking at her that made Melody want to cry. The smile on her mother's face was tight and sad. "None of us know. None of us. My mother died of a heart attack, and she had no idea. We had no idea. And then she was just gone." "Boy," Melody said, "I barely even remember that. I was so young." "It was a long time ago. That's how everything is. At the moment you think it will last forever, and that that's all there will ever be. And then it's been a long time ago. I know, I've been there more than once." Melody sipped her tea. "How did you get through it?" "Well, I cried a lot, and I got angry, and then I cried some more. But then life goes on, and you start dealing with today again, rather than yesterday. You never forget. But somehow you start to remember a little less often. I don't know how Blaine is ever going to face this. Blaine's a strong, good young man. He is, and he will move on. But I don't know how to help him. I don't even know what to say sometimes. Sometimes you say more by just being there than you ever have to with words." Melody nodded. That was certainly true for her this afternoon. The presence of her friends had made an awful day almost bearable. "Just be there for him, like you have been." Her mother reached over and patted her hand. "You'll see." She stood and pulled her ratty old, supposed-to-be-white but hadn't been in years robe around herself. As she sat there looking at her mother, Melody realized how much she would miss that old robe someday, and something about that moment made her realize that there would, in fact, be a someday, a day when her own mother would be gone. The thought snagged her heart. At the door, her mother turned, and Melody looked up again. "I was proud of you today," her mother said, "just so you know." And then she walked out. Melody sat in that kitchen long, long after her mother had left. How many things had Blaine wanted to tell his mom, and now he would never get the chance? How many things had she not said to all those in her life who meant the very most to her? Her gaze dropped to the simple cup sitting on the table. Nobody knows the hour. Nobody. This has been For Real, Book 3, The Courage Series, written by Staci Stallings, narrated by Becky Dowdy. Copyright 2012 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings.
Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel so you never miss a second of the story.